while we start to think about the Christmas story, and we're going to get there here in just a couple of weeks, we're beginning at the genealogy of Jesus that we find in Matthew, and as you read through it, you notice some things. And one of the things that becomes sort of apparent in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew is that there are women present. And in this patriarchal society, that was abnormal. The lines were traced through, the genealogic evidence was about dads and sons. And so that these women are included is the first clue that these are sort of a story unlike any others. And so before we get to the detailed narrative stuff of Jesus' life, Matthew is giving us some insight into the one that he's about to talk to. Now for us, right, we're a pretty individualistic culture. When we talk about why am I qualified, who am I, we tend to think about our own stuff, right? When we're writing a resume, you do not include your parents, most of us. Right? You don't put your dad and his job and his accomplishments and his college education. You put your own. You put your own experience and work and success and accomplishments. That is what you're going to put on a resume. That's what you're going to, when someone is interviewing you, you're going to talk about. But that was not the way this was in the first century. In the first century, what was your resume was your family. In particular for someone who was Israeli, for someone who was Jewish, this family line, what tribe all the way back, right, thousands of years earlier, that was your resume. That was the thing that gave you significance and importance and told people kind of who you were and where you had come from. And so for us, this idea that genealogy is important, and from what is Jesus going to be doing when he comes on the scene, we may miss that a little bit. And even if we separate from the cultural significance of the first century to today, what it should say to us that Matthew is giving us this genealogy. He's saying the family line, there's information in here, right, that is important, that God himself has put it in his word, should say to us, there's stuff here that you should be mining and paying attention to. And when we read it, and we did read it last week, right, and we see these women, we figure out that there's some stories that go along. I have had multiple emails, phone calls, messages wandering through the hallways that told me they had never heard the story of Tamar that we told last week, or at least they'd never heard it quite that way with all of its significances. I had some middle school girls who told me they did not think I had done a very PG-13 job. They thought I had done a rated R job, and so for that I may apologize. But when we think about Tamar, and now we're going to connect Tamar and we're going to begin to look at Ruth, these stories, these women's stories, are telling us something about Jesus, about his coming and his birth, about the very meaning of Christmas. So as we think about Ruth, there's a challenge. Last week, right, we had about 10 verses that we needed to cover, and so we kind of tried to do that and then mine some truth out of it. This morning, Ruth is an entire book of the Bible. Now, it's not a long book, but it's 4 or 5 chapters, and there's a lot there. So I'm going to try and just sort of summarize it and give us sort of the Cliff Notes version of the story. We're going to read a couple sections and passages so that it may make sense, and then we're going to mine out 3 what I hope are really helpful things to us. So let's think about our story. When the story starts, we've got a woman whose name is Naomi. She's married to a guy whose name is Elimelech, and they have 2 sons. Their names are in there, but not really that important. They're going to be dead here in just a second. Thank you for laughing. That was supposed to be funny. I appreciate that. Right? So we've got this woman, husband, 2 sons. They leave Israel. There's a famine going on, and they go to the place called Moab. Now, Moab were in many ways and in many times, it sort of varied who was fighting who throughout Israeli history, but at certain points along the way, these are the enemies of the Israeli people, but there's a famine, and so they've left to go find better hope, right, for their family. And they get there and they have 2 sons. And these 2 sons, as they grow, they marry them to 2 Moabite women. Now, I told you it was coming. Now it's happened. The 2 sons are dead, and the husband, Elimelech, dead. So now here we have Naomi. Naomi is now left with these 2 young Moabite women. All 3 of them together are widows, if we remember our story from last week. What do we know about widows in this day and age, right? Vulnerable, socially, economically, sexually, right? There's nobody to care for them and provide for them and sort of meet their needs. In particular, right? And so because they're no longer in Israel, where they would be sort of at least sort of good, upstanding Jewish folks following the law that you could appeal to, but now they're in Moab, where it's rougher and a little bit, sort of more chaotic and pagan, if you'll let me use that word. And so it's a dangerous sort of time and space, and they've got no men to care for them or provide for them economically. And so Naomi is angry, right? She probably, most people did not want to leave the land of their forefathers, right, and their inheritance, and they would have had to have sold it off to leave Israel and go to Moab. And so here's Naomi. Her life is not going in any way the way that she wants it to. All of the things that she would want and have planned and intended, right? Her sons, and they're growing up, and they're providing for her in old age, and grandchildren, all of these things. None of that is what is taking place. And so she is angry. She's bitter. She's mad. She feels emptied out, it says to us. And we don't know the details of the passing of her 2 sons or husband. We don't know what the cause of those things were. But we know that the thing that comes at the end of that is she's left hopeless. And she is, right, it says, so she's older. Her own words are that she's older. She's past anybody wanting to marry her. She's past having more sons. So she's got no prospects. All of her family is in Israel, far from her. Now, this vulnerable, bitter, angry woman, because she has no men in her life, right? We might read in our 21st century sort of models and minds and go, well, why didn't somebody just come along and tell her she has inherent value and worth and tell her it's going to be okay? And the problem is we read that with the 21st century mind, right? This isn't that. This is in this day and age, she is almost hopeless. Like, that's the reality. She's accurately seeing the picture of her life and her future and her prospects. She is desperate. She's emptied out. And we, right, if we're honest, we might look at her and go, how silly that that's what she would feel, because she doesn't have a man, because she doesn't have a husband, because she doesn't have children. But how many things do we look at and let ourselves feel vulnerable? How many things, right, whether it's our weight or our appearance, or, right, whether we have a kid or how we did at this job or the house that we live in, or we get vulnerable. We get bitter. We get angry. We get feeling emptied out. We get feeling like I'm not enough, and I'm never going to be enough, and my life, and why isn't the Lord coming through for me, and why aren't all of the things I'm asking for not that sort of crazy and desperate, and right? I'm not asking for the moon. I just want sort of normal everyday stuff, and God isn't coming through. We get angry and bitter and vulnerable. We've got burdens. We all do it. We've all got things that we lack. We've all got things that either because we don't have them or because we do have them, right? They leave us in these spots of vulnerability. Naomi at this spot, right? She feels like she has no future, no sort of family name, no prospects. She's devastated. She's at the spot where she believes that the only solution is for her to go back to Israel. Back to the land of family, back to the spot where she sort of already failed, already given up the family land, and go back. And so she does, and she says to these 2 young women, right, these 2 now widows with her daughters-in-law, and she says, listen, don't come with me. There's nothing there. Go back to your families. At least you've got dads, right? As tragic as the Tamar story was even last week, what did he do? He had sent her back to her dad, where at least she was provided somewhat, right? She's got a roof over her head. And Naomi realizes that there is nothing for her in Israel, but she doesn't know what else to do with herself. So that's where she's going to go. But she's saying to these young women, right, she's caring for them. She would want them to come with her. She would want, right, the companionship and the friendship. We see that here in just a second. That there was some relationship that was there, at least with her and Ruth. But she's loving them enough to say, go, just at least go home. Go back. I went away full. There's a line in the text. When she's speaking, she says, I went away, right? I left full. I had these 2 sons and this husband and the future and the prospects and all this, and I've come home emptied out. That's bitter Naomi. What about courageous Ruth in our story? Naomi tries to send both Orpah and Ruth home, back to their own families. And Orpah listens, right? Orpah goes. She's not rude or mean or nasty. She doesn't seem to be angry. She feels released, and her husband is dead, and so she goes back home. But Ruth, something transforms Ruth. There's a spot in Ruth chapter 2, verse 8 that tells us how desperate the situation was. See, Ruth has heard from Naomi what is coming. And what was coming was a dangerous Israel. In this day, apparently, I mean, even Boaz, in Ruth chapter 2, when Ruth is talking to Boaz, before they have sort of gotten to the end of the story, and they're in the middle, and they're figuring out who one another is, and he's feeling responsible for protecting her, he says to her, listen, you've got to stay close to my women, because if you don't stay close to them, I can't sort of guarantee your safety. Right? Again, she's probably young, probably beautiful, and she's this vulnerable, unattached woman who's in the midst of all of the workers, and Israel is in such a state that Boaz himself says, listen, I can't promise that you'll be safe unless you stay sort of inside of the circle of my protection. And that is what Naomi is trying to prevent and protect her from coming back to. But Ruth, something happens to her. Right? She says to Naomi, I'm going to go wherever you are going. Your people are going to be my people. Your God is going to be my God. She is committing herself, tying herself to Naomi's future. She had been released. She could have gone back. She probably was, again, young enough and pretty enough, and could have gone back to the land of Moab and found some hope. But she doesn't do that. And immigration, I don't want to wander us too far into a political arena, but immigration is a funny thing, right? We've got a lot of opinions that are getting spread about immigration and marching people and all kinds of things. But here's the thing about immigration. It is almost always, immigration is about someone in a desperate place wanting to go someplace where their future is brighter. Whatever else you want to think about it, that's what immigration is usually about. Here we see Ruth choosing an immigration path where it looks like the future is darker, where it looks like it's more hopeless and more desperate. And we almost never see that in immigration. Just a little note. Sorry. You can take that what you want. Here's Ruth, right? She's leaving the familiar thing for what would seemingly be a worse life. Now, she becomes, right? We've got sort of depressed, anxious, angry Naomi. We've got courageous Ruth who's going to choose this sort of hard path intentionally so that she can stay with Naomi. And then she becomes what we're going to call breadwinning Ruth. They're back in Israel. And the thing that would happen, sort of Israeli Jewish welfare, was when a field would get gleaned, when it would get harvested, the edges of it would be left behind so that those who were in poverty could come and at least they would be able to have something that would meet their needs. So that they would the workers would sort of take not necessarily the easiest stuff, but the easiest stuff. The stuff that was in the middle, where you're just sort of walking along and it's done. It's sort of en masse. If you think about a field, where they would leave the edges, it would be a little sparser and probably not as well filled in and maybe not as good of yield on those pieces, but that's what they would leave. That was Jewish welfare. And it says to us that Ruth was doing that. She was going to those fields so that she could glean enough, so she could provide. She, the young one, was providing for her and Naomi. They've fashioned this sort of two women, very non-traditional family. And here she is the breadwinner. She's providing for, taking care of Naomi. Now, it says to us in the story that she just happens upon the field of Boaz. And what we know, right, is that with a sovereign God, coincidence does not exist. Coincidence does not exist in the universe of a sovereign God. And so here she's happened upon the field of Boaz. And Boaz sees her. Right? Again, she's probably young, probably beautiful. He would know people, and all of a sudden sort of there's this foreign woman, most likely with a different colored skin, standing at the edge of his field, and he's going, who is she and what's going on? And so he's gathering the story. And he's going to hear the story I just told you, right? Here she is. She's gone away, and she's come back now with Naomi, and they're these desperate widows, and they're at the edge, right? And the men are all dead, and here they are, they're meeting this thing, and Boaz's heart, right, his heart begins to warm towards her. He's asked about her. He's getting her story. He's amazed that she's doing this to take care of Naomi. And she, right, she just knows at first, right, that he's the guy that owns the field. But she's amazed because this guy of sort of position and power and wealth is paying attention. Maybe she's hearing that he's asking about her and taking an interest in her, and he's not just taking advantage of her. Boaz is a good man. He is honorable. He isn't just sort of swooping in and taking advantage of the desperate situation, right? Contrast that with Judah last week. The guy who, when Tamar knows that as long as she's sort of sitting in the right spot, dressed in the right way, he's going to come into her. Boaz is a different sort of man. Now, when Naomi hears this, she hears the story, right? Because Ruth has come home and she's going, okay, well, how did it go and what happened? And tell me about your day. And Ruth starts telling her about Boaz. And Naomi recognizes, again, that coincidentally, but not really because we believe in a sovereign God, she has happened upon the field of the one guy. Maybe there's only two guys in Israel who could be what they need him to be. And what they need him to be is the kinsman redeemer. Now here's the turn in our story, right? Here's where the story starts to get a little more interesting. See, in Israeli law, land is really, really important. Who owns it and possesses it and gets to live there, right? And God, if you think with me, some of us know this, not everybody, but some of us know that way back earlier in Genesis, when God had promised Abraham descendants like the stars, he had promised them land. The promised land, it's called, right? That would flow with milk and honey in this spot, that they are even now, right? These thousands of years later, still fighting over in Israel. The Middle East, constant contention over this land, this promised land. And one of the things about Old Testament law and the land was that the family owned the land. And at a certain way, at a certain sort of level, the family always owns the land. You could, like Elimelech and Naomi had done, sell the land and leave. But it never really left your family. Your family always had the rights to it. They could redeem it. They could buy it back. And the person had to sell it to you. If you came and said, I've got the resources and the money, I can pay you the fair price for it, they had to sell it to you. But there were consequences to that decision. You had to be, right, there had to be the certain person, had to be a kinsman, had to be someone in the line who was willing to come and have the resources to pay for the land, number one. In this particular situation, it had to be someone who was willing to come and not just have the resources to pay for the land, but once they paid for the land, they got a wife. They got Ruth. And they didn't only just get the land, and now they got Ruth, but any children that they have are going to not be in their line, but they're going to be in the Naomi-Elimelech line. And so most people were unwilling to do it. Right? Nobody had stepped up. The story was known. They'd been back in town. Nobody had, even Boaz probably had heard some of the story and hadn't himself pursued it. We're going to find out as we read through here, right, that there was a second guy, someone who was actually closer in the line who should have done this. There was an expectation that would have been done. But again, the cost is so high, not just of the land, but of the marriage and the children, that nobody has stepped up in this sort of way. So Naomi is saying to Ruth in the story, she essentially says to her, why would somebody do this? The cost is too high. There's sort of underwritten, if you read it in what it would really have been saying, what she was saying to Ruth is, why would somebody want to marry you? The whole package is undesirable because it has sort of all of the strings connected to it. Why would he do it? There's an interracial marriage, which was no more popular, maybe even less popular then than now. There's an expense. But Naomi and Ruth together hatch a plan. We're desperate. We've got no other prospects. We've got no other thing. God has put us here in this place. So they hatch a plan. She sends Ruth to his bed, in essence. And so Ruth goes. And again, in essence, what Ruth does is propose marriage to Boaz. She does it quietly. She doesn't do it right in the middle of the field where everybody can see. She goes in the dark of the night. She puts herself under his blanket at his feet. He wakes up. He's an honorable guy. Again, he doesn't take advantage of the situation. He doesn't take advantage of her. And they start to have this conversation. And she, in essence, goes, I want you to do this thing that only you can do. And this is not normal, by the way. Honorable women did not go and lay themselves under the feet and the blanket of honorable men. It's bold, non-traditional, strange behavior. Kind of like Tamar last week, which should tell us something. These women do not fit the traditional sort of church lady model mindset that some of us have. And that sometimes we think our Old Testament characters should have, right? We think of them as sort of the sort of prim and proper, and they've got it all together, and they've got their list of things they do's and don'ts. But Tamar and now in Ruth, women in the very line of the Messiah, bold, strategic, almost right, wise. They are accomplishing things, feminine and assertive. It's just be encouraged, women. And Boaz agrees. He eventually does marry her, right? There's a process. They've got to figure out whether or not this other guy who's a little closer in the line wants to, and he doesn't want to. And so he does redeem him, and Naomi's line is restored. Ruth's sacrificial love, first for Naomi and then for Boaz, it changes things. We see Naomi's heart change, right? Her countenance, her face, everything about her gets transformed. Ruth's life is transformed. Boaz's life is transformed. He becomes someone where for his power and his influence, right, he becomes someone who uses those things for good and for redemption. And this blended family, this sort of, right, mother-in-law, foreign daughter-in-law, and now son thrown into the mix of all of this thing, this weird blended family becomes the very line of the king. And not just King Jesus, but King David. This becomes the very spot where we see the the royal line of Israel come from? She didn't just bring Naomi's name back. Ruth didn't just redeem, right? Boaz didn't just redeem Ruth and Naomi and sort of but the very name of names, the King of Kings. So Ruth, a vulnerable immigrant from the Middle East with the wrong colored skin, impoverished, vulnerable, desperate, look at what God can do. Look at what he has done through her. So what do we learn about Christmas, right? Isn't that why we're here today, maybe? Some things I want us to mine a little bit. One of these, I want us to see the friendship of Naomi and Ruth. And I want to see the transformative power of real friendship. Again, think with me about this story. This story of these two women. And you've got Naomi, right? And she's this older woman, and she's sort of angry and bitter and desperate. But whatever, that's Naomi. Whatever Ruth had seen in her was more than that. And again, we've got sort of the short, just like capsulized version, even as I've told the story, even as we read the story, we don't get some of the other stuff and details, but it's pretty clear that there was more to their relationship than just angry, bitter Naomi. She had seen something, Ruth had seen something in her. Isn't that real friendship? Real friendship is that we share our lives. We sit and eat meals together. We know one another's spouses, right? Our kids and our lives, and sometimes our vacations and our holidays and sometimes when we gather in church and worship, and not just our good days, right? But real, true, valuable friendship shares our bad days, maybe even our worst days. Maybe that's the person that knows when you're squabbling with your spouse or your kids or your mother. Maybe they're the people who know when your job is lost. They're the people who know because you've shared your life with them. And we live in a day, right, when the idea of sharing our religious thoughts, right, we're in the holiday season, and one of the things, right, that good people say is, whatever you do, don't talk about, right, politics and religion when you're sitting around certain things. But our friends, don't they know that stuff about us? Don't they know what we believe? Don't they know what we hold to? Don't they know what on when the chips are really down, where we go? And as friends, as those who are in real life, and we've got neighbors and coworkers and employees and people who know us, I think it's important that we begin to see that we are supposed to be sharing our faith. And again, sometimes that feels really scary, and it feels like this sort of guilty burden, like you should be evangelizing, and you should be telling people, and you should be talking. What I think it really means is that the people know what's important and valuable to you. They know what you hope in. I was talking to somebody just this week, and they've got a friend that they've been trying to share Jesus and looking for those opportunities. And this is not a 1 week or a 2 week or a 2 month or a 2 year relationship. They've got this one friend, and they've been sharing for a long time. And just this week, that person looked at my friend and went, I don't understand why this gospel thing seems so important. And the thing that spurred the conversation, some of you saw in the news, there was a missionary who was going to try and reach an unreached people group, and it was very controversial, made the big news because he didn't even sort of make it into them. They shot and killed him sort of on the beach, very reminiscent of Jim Elliot and those 5 down there in the Auca Indians from the 50s. And so there all of a sudden there was this debate about whether or not we should be doing mission, and whether or not we should be doing evangelism, and weren't these people sort of just better off without this Western thought? And so the conversation began to be about evangelism, and my friend got to share the gospel. This is why we think this is so important. This is why I do think that person should go and share, because it's life-changing, eternity-shaping news. But it was fostered over the course of almost a decade-long friendship. And that's what we see happening here. Look at Ruth chapter 1. Ruth says, right, Naomi has said to her, you should go back. You, Orpah, you two should go back to your families. At least someone there will take care of you. And Ruth says to her, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And if we stop there, with sort of big G God, we're not sure what she means, right? Because everybody's got a God. And so we're not even sure at this point in the story who is Naomi's God, right? Because they've been in Moab. And there's some other references here that's going to say to us that maybe the Moabite gods are Naomi's gods, and that's why she was maybe even sending them back. But notice the next line. Your people shall be my people, your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. That word there where it's Lord, capital L, Lord, that's Yahweh. That's the God of the Exodus. That is God. And so whatever, right, wherever spot Naomi is in now, sort of bitter and angry and sort of just pushing anybody away that she can push away, Ruth has seen something in her at some point along the way that went, your relationship to Yahweh God is the thing that I want. He's my God. And I believe this is the moment of her conversion. I believe this is the moment when she is captured, but what's she captured by? What's the thing that's transformative here? I think the thing that's transformative is Naomi's willingness to sacrifice herself, to love her enough to go, I know the road that I'm about to walk, and I love you enough to not just hold on to you and go, you're going to come with me, so I've got somebody to walk it with me. But you, I want you to be safe. I want you to be taken care of. You go back, even at great cost to myself. And I think in that moment, the exclusive claims of eternal God were seen through the wide open, boundless grace that she was willing to show to Ruth in her friendship. And if we're going to live a life like this, Naomi is saying, listen, you're wanting blessing, you've got to be blessed by the Lord. That's what she's been saying to her. See, I think that what Naomi is doing is not saying, it doesn't matter what God you worship, go back to your family, go back to your gods. I think that what she is saying is, I love you so much, I'm releasing you at great sacrifice and cost to myself. And in that sacrificial love, in that friendship, in the I care more about your needs than my own needs, she's sending her because she loves her. And in that moment, Ruth says, I want your God. I want the faith that I've seen demonstrated in you right now, that I've been seeing demonstrated in you probably in at least the months or the years that we've already lived together. I want the faith that I've seen in you, and the faith that I see in you even in this desperate moment that maybe you don't see in yourself. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. I think that Ruth can see in Naomi stuff that Naomi can't even any longer see in herself. Her love for Ruth in the midst of her disbelief is the greatest apologetic. That she is willing to sacrifice and care for somebody who didn't believe what she believed. Right? Because Ruth isn't part of the Jewish community. She doesn't have that bond with her. But Naomi is willing to love her anyway. Naomi is willing, even in the midst of her lostness, to love her and value her and see her as significant. She was willing to sacrifice for her. Naomi's non-exclusive love demonstrates the exclusive claims of her God. Ruth was saying, I see the way you are loving me in the moment, willing to send me away. This is the opportunity in friendship. We share our life, we share our love and our passion, we share our beliefs and our concerns. They see us at our worst and our best. Loving people in deep friendship, regardless of what they believe, makes what we believe more credible. It's in the course of life. For some of us, it's in the course of bitter days, empty moments, that those around will see what we actually believe. They see what we actually count on. They see what works, what sustains, what brings us peace and joy. Ruth is changed by Naomi's sacrificial commitment to her. And get this, I think that's how almost everybody comes to faith at a certain point. That doesn't mean I don't think a sermon isn't important, or that, that we don't have to come to moments when we sort of call for the question, and what do you believe in? But almost always there's a person in someone's life that has been demonstrating to them, this is what God-like sacrificial love looks like. I'm going to love you for who you are, as you are. While you're still broken and lost, I'm going to love you. The thing that transforms is the experience of unconditional love, seeing the gospel worked out in our lives as we love those people around us. Now we see what I would call the true formula for friendship right here in this text. Right? What did Ruth say to Naomi? Naomi, wherever you go, I'm going to go. Wherever you stay, I'm going to stay. She says, my time, right? True friendship always takes time. True relationship takes time. It isn't sort of forged in seconds. True friendship takes repetitive, over and over. I'm going to put myself in your way, and you're going to put yourself in mine, and we're going to drive over here, and we're going to do this thing, and we're going to sit here and watch this dumb football game, and we're going to spend time together. That's how friendship is forged. In commitment, and it takes both things. Right? What's the second part of what she says to her? Not even death, right? Until one of us is dead, nothing's going to part us. I'm tying myself to you. I'm committed to you. And doesn't real friendship take commitment? It takes commitment on the day when the person is hard to love. It takes commitment because on the day when they're moving and you've got to show up with your truck and carry the box. Meg and I, through the first 10 years of our life, moved 12 times. The people who were still showing up by the 12th time were our friends. And there weren't very many of them, quite frankly. And I don't say that meanly or rudely, right? Because the commitment to show up again and again and again. On the bad day and the good day and the hard day and the 1 in the morning day. Friendship shows up over time and is committed. May we be those kinds of friends. Well, life-changing power of friendship. Let's talk about God working even when we can't see it and things look impossible. Naomi thought it was impossible. That's why she sent the girls away. Naomi had no hope. She was desperate. She couldn't see that underneath, even in the hardest places of her life, God was still moving and working. She couldn't see that there are 10,000 ways, 10,000 things under the surface that the Lord is doing and accomplishing. It's interesting. When you study sort of the whole of the Bible, you learn to take books and kind of think about them uniquely and what makes this book different from that book and what's the story here and who's the audience here. And one of the interesting things that we learn about the book of Ruth is there is no miracle. Right? We tend to think of, biblical narrative, we wait for the miracle. We wait for the burning bush and the water out of the rock and the staff rises and the seas part and we've got Jesus and he's feeding, the 12,000 people and the resurrection. Right? We are looking for the miraculous stuff. The book of Ruth has no miracle. There's no desperate prayer for something, for the earth to stop and the sun to shine and rain to come where there wasn't. None of those things. There's just no miraculous stuff. It's just the mundane, everyday life of two widows whose husbands are dead, who are desperate and hopeless. And a woman who gets up and goes, well, the thing I can do is go work and I can go get the edge of this field and glean and I'll just go be faithful in sort of these small things. And And even then, right, it's not some Shekinah moment where the heavens open and kablowy, there's a lightning strike. It's just everyday conversation and moment, and this guy's a good guy and he's protecting her, and this. It's just the mundane stuff of life, which should encourage us, right? Because don't our lives look a whole lot more like that than parted Red Seas and mountaintops with, Elijah standing next to us? Most of us live sort of mundane, ordinary, got up today, had a cup of coffee like I got up yesterday, and had a cup of coffee like I got up the day before, and had a cup of coffee. And when we lead sort of mundane, everyday, ordinary lives, and if we're honest, right, the reality is we don't expect that the Lord is going to lightning blast us. And this story should give us some hope. Because the Lord works in the ordinary and the mundane. He is doing stuff. When we talk about the sovereignty of God, as we did just a couple of weeks ago, there should be joy there, because we know He is moving and working in ways we just flat out cannot see. Naomi walks back into Bethlehem. Right? She comes, and when she gets there, she sees like sort of her old friends that she probably had left behind and said, boy, I don't know that I'll ever see you guys again. And she walks back in, and it says that she says when she left, she was full, and when she comes back, she feels empty. She's declaring herself empty. The amazing thing to me is she's probably standing there in the midst of her friends, and they're like, my goodness, we didn't know you were ever going to come back. Who's this standing next to you? Oh, this is Ruth. I'm empty. I've got nothing. Could you imagine being Ruth in that moment? Guess I'm chopped liver. See, she doesn't even recognize that the very thing that is her redemption is standing beside her. The thing, the vehicle that the Lord is going to use for her redemption, for her saving, for her protection, for her provision, for her restoration is standing beside her the whole time. She feels emptied out. She feels vulnerable. She feels bitter and angry. And Ruth is there the whole time. And some of us are right there. Right? We've got an agenda. We had a plan. We thought this was the thing. This was next. I was going to go here. I was going to go to school there. I was going to marry this person. We were going to have X number of kids. We were going to live in this sort of town. And we were going to... And it is not working out that way. The future you thought you were crafting and organizing and ordaining, that God was sort of just going to come alongside. He's doing something entirely different. And you, like Naomi, would say, I am bitter. I'm angry, and I'm emptied out, and the things that I want, the things that I thought I deserved and I needed are not happening. And you might look, maybe at your friends, right? Maybe at your family, maybe the people around you, and you go, the stuff that I want isn't happening. Where's God? Why isn't He showing up? I'm just mad. Sometimes we're not quite honest enough to say those words. I'm just mad at God because He isn't doing what I want Him to do. But if we're honest with ourselves, isn't that the truth? But we don't see how He is possibly working in the mundane. There's a spot in the story of The Lord of the Rings, which is one of my favorite book series, and the hobbits, it's early in the story, and the hobbits are scared and nervous, and they're not real sure what's happening, and they're kind of being hunted, and they end up in this weird tavern with big tall men, and they're scared and overwhelmed, and they don't know what. And all of a sudden they find themselves in relationship with someone who looks a little rough, and he's tall and kind of scary himself, and then it gets revealed down the line that the person that they'd been talking to, the person that they were now traveling with, is the very king of the entire kingdom. The person they thought was just sort of this mundane, everyday, average person sitting in the tavern, drinking and looking scary, turns out to be sort of the source of life and promise. And that's the message here. Often in the mundane, when we sit down, when all of a sudden we've got a friend that we didn't know and somebody moved in next to us and there's a coincidence, and all of a sudden we've got a coworker who's sitting in the cubicle next to us, and all of a sudden we've got this stuff, and our kids playing on this soccer team, and we get to know this mom, and we're building friendships and we're building relationships, and what we figure out is that the Lord, in the midst of those mundane, in the midst of that everyday and that ordinary, is doing stuff and connecting things and accomplishing. And it's not just that's the message of Christmas. There's no mistake. Like when we come tonight, right, the manger is going to be sitting up here. Do you know how many mangers there are in the world? Nobody knows. Countless mangers, right? Mangers all over. There's livestock and feed all over. How many thrones are there, though? There's a limited number. There's a tiny little number of thrones. The Lord, when he wants to impact, he's just doing it through the mundane, everyday thing there's thousands of, millions of. Because he's that kind of God. He comes through the mangers and not through the thrones. It doesn't mean he can't use a throne. It just means that most of the time, for most of us, it's the everyday, ordinary stuff. That's how he works. Naomi couldn't see that the Lord was going to work through Ruth. While Ruth is clinging to her, attached to her, coming along with her, she doesn't see that is God himself moving and ordaining and working and clinging to her, providing for her future. In the midst of Naomi's desperation, bitterness, emptiness, it was still her love for Ruth that transforms. For some of us, right, and again, some of us sit here this morning, and if we're honest, if we'll quiet our own minds, we know this is true. This is who we are. Bitter, angry, our plan is not what's coming true. The Lord, we're desperate. And yet, like Naomi, I believe the Lord is moving and working through you and in you if you will open your eyes. If you will look at the things that he is accomplishing. If you will look at the ones who are around you, who are watching you, who are observing you, who are friending you. Their friendship still offers hope. Even when we don't see it, even when we don't feel it. Naomi is angry. She cannot see what the Lord is doing. And for some of us, maybe even most of us, I think it's so often we come sort of to the end, and then we look back and we go, oh my goodness, the Lord was using that? That's how he was going to get that done? That's how this person was coming to faith? That's how this question was getting answered? And sometimes, friends, we are Naomi, and sometimes we are Ruth. And sometimes we are the very vehicle of the accomplishing. Sometimes as we cling to one another in friendship, as we have a friend who is bitter and angry, and maybe they're rejecting, maybe they're saying things in their honest moments about their own frustrations, we get to be the Ruth who stands quietly by and just goes, I'm here. I'm going to cling to you. Your life and my life, and we're tied together, and the Lord has called me to love you and keep loving you, and I'm going to do it. And sometimes we're Naomi and sometimes we're Ruth. But in the mundane, the Lord is redeeming. Well, as we close this morning, one last point. I think the gospel of grace destroys our preconceived notions. I'm going to work through these just really quickly, but we have a culture that really values family, right? And there's sort of that, like the husband and wife and the kids, and we've got sort of these, and that's what's most important. And I think that what this should say to us is, the Lord wants to blow up sometimes our notion of family. And he wants us to get past our prejudice and begin to recognize that some families, though they may look non-traditional, and some relationships, though they may look non-traditional, are still his vehicles, still what he is doing and accomplishing. Ruth chooses grace, she chooses faith, and she chose Naomi. And so this non-traditional family of sort of this older widow and this younger widow, and it's that very vehicle that the Lord uses. And I think we need to be cautious that we that we don't overemphasize. I think the family in our day can become an idol. And that's a whole nother sermon, and we'll get there someday. Another one is interracial marriage. And we're still living here in the middle of middle America, and I know that for some of us that's still a almost radical notion, but think about this. If this story is true, I believe it is, by the way, then Jesus' line is an interracial line. And I hope that for some of us who maybe still have deep prejudice, maybe we don't show them very often, maybe it's sitting here, and maybe we just go, well, I know I learned that from my dad, and I learned that from my grandpa, and we need to really, I just think there's a thing that needs to be taking place in us as we see these things. That the racial lines that we often draw, and even some of our hidden prejudices, we need to really be careful of. I mean, last week, the Savior of the world comes through the product of incest, and this week it's through interracial marriage. So maybe the Lord works in mysterious ways. The third one of these is that men are better than women. Again, as much as we may not say it or think it, right? We live in a day when there's sort of battles going on around us about that, but we see the Lord use and work through these women. It's interesting, right? We might think Ruth was written yesterday, last week, last month, last year. This is a story that was written 2,500 years ago. It's not the product of the Me Too movement. Here's the thing, guys. I think that we sometimes, when we see the Christmas story, what we see is sort of this tiny little baby, and we see this husband and this wife, and they've walked, and she's pregnant, and we think about shepherds, and we think about kings, and we think about angels, and we think about this baby. And some of us even think about what that baby's going to grow up to if we're wise. But I think what's significant is that we see that this is one piece in a long story that the Lord has been telling for, quite frankly, eternity past and future. That a sovereign God is moving and working and shaping. And through little things like interracial marriage and the stuff of last week's story. And that the gospel that we so often, right, we relegate to sort of the cross moment. The redemptive plan of our God is big, and we and our relationships and our friendships and our in-laws and our children and our stuff, all of those are part of His redemptive plan. So may we be faithful this year. I don't know all the situations and circumstances you're going to get called into. I don't know all the ways that you're going to have the moments in time you're going to have to say, this is why I have hope. This is maybe why I'm upset, and this is why I doubt, and this is why I'm frustrated, but the Lord is good. And here's what He's done in my life, and here's what He can do in yours. And I'm not going to abandon you on your worst day. I'm not going to abandon you because you believe the wrong thing. I'm going to call you to something much greater. Friends, the story of Ruth is a story that should point us to the reality that the Lord moves and works in ways way beyond what we see. And He is accomplishing way more down the line than we will ever know. Let's pray today. Father, we come. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful that You are, on my worst days, still doing good stuff. I'm grateful that on my worst day You don't run, but You show Your true friendship. And while I was still a sinner, while I was still broken, You came close and You sent me Jesus. Father, we rejoice that even this morning as we think about it, as we start to turn our face in the direction of Christmas and the holiday season and the lights and the trees and the manger scenes and the nativities and the kids and the costumes, that all of those things are a celebration of the reality that in the midst of real lives, of real anger and bitterness and feeling far away from you, you are still drawing people to yourself. You are still redeeming. You are still taking those that were empty and filling them up, taking those that are bitter and giving them joy, taking those that are broken and restoring and fixing. And we rejoice that you're that kind of a God. And we pray these things in the name of that Jesus. Amen.